Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today on Care Connections, a podcast series where we have real talk on rare conditions. Sanofi Genzyme has been committed to supporting the rare disease community for over 35 years. On our show, we tend to focus on the people who are living with a health condition. Today, we're going to focus on those that are a critical part of a person's journey with a health condition, their caregivers. Joining us again for today's episode is Dr. Kendra Bjoraker. We spoke with her in our last episode focusing on the patient's perspective of living well with a rare disease. Now we'll be talking with her about the mental health side of dealing with the loved one's diagnosis and being a long-term caregiver. Dr. Bjoraker is an expert pediatric neuropsychologist who has worked for over 20 years with patients and families affected by rare medical disorders to help them learn and accept their losses and limitations, and also to help them transform their experiences into something livable and bearable, to help them focus not on what was, but the possibilities that can still be. So we are so excited to start this episode. Let's get started. Welcome, Dr. Bjoraker. We're so happy to have you here with us.
Well, welcome me. Thank you very much.
So today we are going to be focusing on the care circle. Can you start by talking about the common emotional or psychological challenges that members of the care circle may face when their loved one is diagnosed with a lysosomal storage disease?
This is a very unique experience because members of the care circle can feel, first and foremost, isolated and not well understood, which leads to anger and resentment and irritability. And they may experience some depression and anxiety for good reason because they don't know what's happening. Caregivers, they become more distressed and anxious and depressed if they're unable to participate in things that they typically do. So valued activities, interests, going out with friends. And the second thing that members of the care circles feel is really unprepared. Because when you think about it, when you get a diagnosis and the doctor or your team is sitting in front of you, you're the one that gets the information. And so they have to either go online and figure it out, and they struggle with accessing resources that they don't know even exist, which causes really a lot of panic, anxiety, and burnout.
In our last episode, you talked about how patients often go through a grieving process when diagnosed. Do members of the care circle also go through that similar grieving process? And what does that look like?
They certainly do go through the same grieving process because, like I said before, it's an end or it's a change. It's a metamorphosis into something that they didn't have in their mind as having. And so they had to really switch gears very quickly. Not only did they have to switch gears, they experience a little bit different emotions in that they have to be the caregiver, they have to be the cheerleader. At the same time they juggle that, they have a sense of sadness and emptiness and guilt because they don't have it. They have anxiety. Am I going to do this right? What's going to happen? And then possibly some anger.
And do you think that different family members are impacted in different ways? For instance, whether it's a sibling or a spouse?
Oh, yes. Everybody reacts differently based on their experiences they've had all their life up until that point. And so it's your perception of how you view the world, how you view other people. So if it's a sibling, siblings are affected. And I've seen this in some of the lysosomal storage diseases where 3 of the siblings have it, 1 does not. And so that sibling feels very guilty, or they sometimes quit coming around because they don't know how to handle the ones who were diagnosed. If younger, they feel loss, isolation. Another thing is they also may over-identify and worry about getting the condition. And I want to say this to the listeners who have small children. The small children naturally eavesdrop. And so they take on the worry and the anxiety and the mood of the parent who is
Mm-hmm.
discussing the chronic condition. Also, siblings might feel pressure to overachieve. Siblings might say, I can't even complain about a headache or a
Mm-hmm.
hangnail because you have this chronic condition. They may feel resentment if special treatment's given to someone and they don't have that same special treatment. Or on the flip side, I've seen this a lot, is when, let's say that the one that has the condition takes up so much time, and the one that doesn't has a lot of cancellations in their life. And so if it interrupts the general continuity of life, then resentment and anger kind of bubble up. But on the flip side, and this is really exciting, they can feel really empowered and they can feel very wise about it. And then they start learning about the disease or condition and they become very, very involved. And many of the siblings actually go on to be nurses or doctors or in the care field.
No, that's very true. And we find that all the time. A lot of times when we speak to siblings, they have wanted to continue on helping people in that capacity. Very interesting. So I also want to talk about parents. So when we think about a child's caregiver, we often think of a parent. And I can imagine that biological parents may feel a degree of guilt having potentially been the one to pass on the disease. So how do parents tend to respond to a child's diagnosis of a lysosomal storage disease?
This is on a spectrum. I've
Mm-hmm.
seen those who do not respond well, and then I've seen those who work through it. But there are several reactions to finding out your child has a genetic condition which you don't have any of the symptoms.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have a child, can you imagine, carrying a child for 9 months, giving birth to the child, and all of a sudden the doctor says they have this genetic condition. Again, you have to go through the grieving process, but I call it the shame, blame, worry. It has a certain term. It's called genetic guilt process, where parents feel guilty and have a lot on their plates. They feel guilty if they do something fun with their friends. They feel guilty if they don't. They have to learn so many things. It's a steep learning curve. So the parents actually have to learn all the medical terms. They have to learn the insurance terms. They have to learn the educational terms. They have to learn everything on how to navigate hospital systems, different doctor personalities. At the same time, they're keeping the rest of the family going.
Mm-hmm.
They're feeling grief and guilt and fear and confusion. But the only thing that can lessen that guilt is to know you did nothing wrong. Because unfounded guilt, it'll drain you. It'll erode the confidence required for you to make wise decisions. It becomes decision fatigue. It causes parents to focus on the past rather than really going into the future and advocating. And I know this from a personal experience. I lost my son in 2007, and I can't stress enough for parents to take care of themselves and to lessen the guilt that you did nothing wrong. That only comes with, some talking about it, putting words to it, self-care, and somehow replacing that guilt with a purpose.
Yeah, and that comes back a lot to what you said in the first episode of finding that meaning and purpose within the disease. Another common type of caregiver is a partner or spouse. So when the caregiver is a partner, how do you think that impacts the relationship? And do you have any tips to maintain a healthy relationship?
I have so much to say about this one because I think it goes both directions. So the one who has the chronic condition feels very, very guilty and like they're somehow holding back what they want their spouse to have. And couples are most satisfied when there's a give and take and it's equitable. So when somebody has a chronic condition, partners seem to accept some inequity if the patient has a lot of physical limitations, let's say, and they can't do things with the other one. And then the other one takes on guilt. So it's just this, it's like a catch-22. It's like going in a revolving door, in and out, in and out. And I'm going to tell you something. When I watched patients come into the clinic, I would just kind of stand back. And I would guess, even before knowing what the condition is, if it's an excellent condition or if it's a autosomal recessive. Because a lot of times when the genetic condition is the fault of one of the parents, then a lot of blame and a lot of negativity is put on that person. If it's autosomal recessive and both of them carry the genetic variant, they don't have that and they sit together more. So we have to come, full circle, talk about it, communicate in an honest, safe, problem-solving way that can promote deep respect for validating each partner's needs.
So you mentioned earlier that caregivers and other members of the care circle can experience anxiety. We also know that they may experience depression. So what does that look like, and what are the symptoms for listeners who may not know?
This is very critical to know this. I was giving a talk a couple of years ago, and I was talking about actually depression and anxiety, and a woman in the audience raised her hand, and it was just the most profound question to me because I made the assumption that people should know what it feels like. And she said, "What does it feel like to be depressed?" Because maybe I am and I don't know it. And I think that as a society, we often use terms, but we don't explain what we mean. Depression can have somatic components such as fatigue, just terrible fatigue, like being in slow motion, like being under the water and treading the water and can't come up out of the water. Either you overeat or undereat, and you become hypervigilant. This has been experienced in watching patients is where they watch everything very closely. They ask questions all the time, but that's to be expected. But when it gets to the point where it's controlling their thoughts, that's where people need help. There's a loss of interest. So they might have liked to have done things before and they don't anymore. They don't have any feelings one way or the other. So they become pretty indifferent, but they feel helpless, like nothing's going to help the situation. And then they become hopeless. They have sleep issues, like oversleep, undersleep, feelings of worthlessness, guilt, or, it's really amazing. They could do really reckless behavior, things that they've never done before. And I'll give you a quick example of this. When parents come in, I say that, you're going to go through a process. And sometimes if you don't understand that process, you could go through a period where you do maybe things you didn't do before, like buy a Harley Davidson, or you get 5 to 10 tattoos, or do something you typically wouldn't do. And I had this guy come in and he pulled up his sleeve and he goes, "Oh no, look at." And I said, "Hey, okay." So he got that out of the way. And he said, "Yeah, but that's the type of thing that he would never have typically done before." But that's what I mean. And, it's a way to control the pain you're feeling at the time is to do something that's out of ordinary. It's a way of controlling it.
You mentioned the signs of depression. In terms of anxiety symptoms, is that more that hypervigilance that you were describing?
Yes, they become hypervigilant. They don't know when to settle down. So they're always kind of ramped up. They're really quick to temper. They never seem to be satisfied with an activity or, no matter what they do, it just doesn't fulfill them. But they're always like waiting for the other shoe to drop and anticipating that. So anxiety is feeling really ramped up, can't calm your thoughts down, especially when you go to sleep.
Got it. And then my final question on this is, can anxiety and depression exist at the same time? Or do you typically go through a period of depression and then have more moments of anxiety?
You can have both. And so
Mhm.
the real estate in the brain kind of shows that you can have both. Usually you become angry and the anger becomes depression and then depression becomes anxiety. But people sometimes are just naturally born to be more of an anxious type person. So
Mhm.
there's some sort of biological undertones to that as well. And neurotransmitters go together as well. And then how you have learned to cope and what has
Mhm.
worked for you. But you can have both or you can have one. But it's very good to figure that out through a
Mhm.
professional so that you can get the focused therapy that you need that will help the most.
So clearly, a diagnosis within the family unit or with someone close to you can take an emotional toll, and they may be focused on that person rather than themselves. So, what advice would you give to members of the care circle to make sure that they take care of themselves and their well being while also taking care of their family member?
Elise, I'm so happy you asked this because, a lot of focus goes on just the care of the person who has the chronic condition. And if I could split up the screen, it would be okay, we're going to concentrate on the one who has the chronic condition. We're going to focus on the one that is caretaking. But I think we often ignore that person. And then they end up having a lot of stomach issues. They have sometimes nightmare. It turns into post-traumatic stress disorder. They become very isolated. So it's so critical. It's going to be harder to do than things that I say. Because
Right.
there's so many times and hours in a day and minutes in an hour. But you have to eat properly, get enough rest and exercise, even if it's for a few minutes. Now, movement is what I like to call it. Take some time and don't feel guilty. Please do activities that you enjoy or you've always wanted to do. Seek non judgmental support. And what I mean by that is sometimes you can tell a friend how you're feeling and they can come right back and say, oh, you shouldn't be feeling that way.
Mhm.
Seek support that is very free of all judgment and put your feelings on paper. Good self care, I can't say this enough, is the foundation for everything else you do. Nothing else happens if you do not take care of yourself. It's not okay to do that. It makes you a whole thinking, feeling person who is doing what you need to do to take care of yourself. Embrace it because you're no good. You're no good to anyone if you do not take care of yourself. I've had people who are taking care of people say, I go to the dentist just to get away. And that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about doing things that you really, really enjoy doing. Get back to the hobbies, get back to something and just carve out a little bit of time for yourself.
Yeah, that's so true. And by taking care of yourself and making sure that your needs are being met, you have more space to potentially provide care for your loved one as well. So, how can members of the care circle do both, as you're suggesting, provide support for their loved one and for themselves?
You have to set time during the
Hmm.
day. You have to understand what your needs are because sometimes your needs get buried and they get buried so deeply you don't even know what you like. And you become so tired of making decisions. People in general hate to ask other people for help. And other people will say, oh, let me know what I can do for you. And that really sometimes angers those people who are caretakers or caregivers because, good intentions mean nothing. And they find What angers them is the inconsistency of the help. They just want consistent help. So make sure that you tell them exactly with clarity what you need them to do. They could also find resources. If you can't find resources, say, hey, here's what I want you to do. I want you to look this up. I want you to look, activities in the community that I could do. You can do X, Y, and Z. I need a pound of sugar. Could you put it on my doorstep? I don't have time to talk, but caregivers have to tell what they want. Move in the direction of your values, and clarity will come in helping you decide what's useful, because this is where you want to pour your energy into.
Excellent. Yeah, I like your point about being specific and telling others how they can help you. I think that's really helpful, even though some people might find it challenging to have those conversations. So, do you have any recommendations for ensuring open and safe communication between caregivers and people who can provide them support and their loved ones?
Yeah, you need to discuss it. So I was giving a talk, and it was to caregivers, and somebody raised their hand and said, I'm a care receiver and they're not doing it right. And sometimes we always think as caregivers, we're doing everything right. But if you look at really what they want, it's not in line. We have a misconception about what appropriate care should be given. But again, it goes back to that communication, and don't be fearful of letting your needs known. And if somebody needs help, gently say to them, I've noticed that you're really anxious or depressed, and talk to them about it. Knowing the patient's needs is very, very critical. Knowing how they feel, letting them talk in an open manner so that we understand them. Both people need to do that.
You remind me of another time you were speaking to a couple, and the wife had a rare genetic disease, and her husband assumed that what she wanted was him to fix everything. And what she really wanted was just for him to listen. And
so true.
so they talked about that challenge they experienced at the beginning, where they both were trying to help and work together, but what they both needed was different than what they were receiving.
Oh, you couldn't have said it more clearly. Intuitively, men like to fix things. Also, when they know they can't fix something, that also interrupts their equilibrium. And so they have to get through that they cannot fix all the time. But communication, to become an engaged listener, I always say communication is less about talking and more about listening. I mean, listen without preconceived ideas of what you're going to say after the person gets done talking. And then really look at them, their nonverbal, their facial expressions and posture, and how they're breathing, how they're putting their arms. And these are just some communication techniques that I recommend. And everybody, I want to tell you, I can't scream this enough, is put your cell phones down, because there's nothing more irritating than pouring your heart out and then somebody checking their emails. It's like, oh, are you kidding me? So avoid all distractions, close the curtains, turn off the TV, take everything out of your pockets, just get rid of everything, put your mind at ease, and just listen with your heart.
No, that's so true. And that's true of not only these types of conversations, but really any conversation in general. So how does communication differ based on the age or different people? So how does that context change that type of communication?
Yeah, again, we're talking about the context. Children have to be talked to at their developmental level. And I think that by sharing appropriate information, just enough for your child's developmental level and temperamental level, you can enable the child to trust that adults will give enough information, work through their feelings, be included, not isolated, feel safe, and able to help. I cannot tell you how many times I've seen patients come in, and if I say to them, do you know why you're here? They'll go, no. And they wouldn't even know they had the chronic condition. And I think that becomes really anxiety provoking for children if parents don't tell them what disease that runs in the family, but tell it at a developmental level. If they've inherited the disease, they may look at other family members to see how they reacted. Children take everything in, everything in. And I also often say we need to have a yield, go, and stop on children, because yield means youth internalize every little detail. And so they pick up everything. And if they don't have all the information, they're going to make assumptions, and their imagination is going to get away with them. So we have to acknowledge your child's feelings, but also understand they can't always label them and express them.
So some caregivers may work with psychologists. What would you recommend for caregivers looking for a psychologist?
Well, they have to have interpersonal skills, the psychologist does. That is, they have to show warmth, really be accepting, empathic, good language skills. You need to trust the psychologist and make sure that you're both on the same page. Somebody that will inspire you, and also inspire you and rely on the best research evidence that is possible for whatever you're going there to get help with.
In the last episode, you talked a lot about how patients should build a good relationship with their psychologist. What advice or recommendations would you give for caregivers or members of the care circle to build a good relationship with their psychologist?
Well, they have to be honest. They can't go in and sugarcoat it or anything. They have to be honest and say exactly how they're feeling, what they're up against. They have to share it with clarity. The professional also has to know the medical concepts, and the patient letting the professional know what type of information. So really the caregiver might have to educate the psychologist about the condition. And then a good sign of a good psychologist and a good relationship is somebody that will say, wait a minute, I've not heard of that. Can we just take 5 minutes, or give me something that I can fall back on? Mm-hmm. Then and only then is the information shared with compassion, and an expectation of support is established and nurtured. You have to feel nurtured, especially going in as a caregiver or part of the care team or care circle.
And would you recommend that members of the care circle see the same psychologist as a patient, or do you think it's okay if they see separate people?
Oh, boy. If you don't live like in an isolated region, so if you don't live in, let's say, states like Montana or Wyoming, North and South Dakota, where you have to travel a huge distance. When I worked at Colorado, we had people drive in from Montana, Wyoming, the Dakotas. Wow. There were only a few psychologists in that area. If you do not live in one of those regions, then no, I would not recommend you see the same psychologist unless you're going there for couples or marriage therapy. Because if a psychologist sees more than one family member, they have to be really careful to avoid conflicts that could sabotage the treatment, lead to like termination. So there's some bias that goes into that, or let's say the therapist can relate to the caregiver rather than the care receiver. So I would recommend not, unless you live in an isolated area.
And what other types of support and resources would you recommend for members of the care circle?
Just support groups, therapy, just establish good friends and family who want to help. If you have someone who can help, let them know. Like I said, be very specific. Give them a list, but also on the flip side, say no. If you can't do something, learn to say no, and then surround yourself with things that inspire you, make you happy, encouragement, educate yourself, take care of yourself, explore relaxation techniques, or just take a moment in nature.
So much great advice. both this episode and the last episode. So before we end, do you have anything else you would like to share with our listeners when it comes to caring for someone with a rare disease?
Well, for patients and their families, I want to say hope is an integral part of coping. Hope is a process that makes meaning. You have to have hope. It's a fundamental human experience. And above all, hold on to that, because everything that is done in hope.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for sharing your time with us today. We found it extremely helpful, and we hope our listeners have too. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you.
So we learned so much on this episode, and we really can't thank Dr. Bjoraker enough for sharing her expertise and experience. Caring for someone with a rare genetic disease can impact all aspects of your life. If you're a caregiver and you need support, you can visit the Caregiver Action Network at www.rarecaregivers.org to learn more about the support and resources available to you. We'd like to thank Dr. Bjoraker again for joining us to talk about living well while caring for someone with a rare disease. If you haven't already, make sure you check out our previous episode, Living Well with a Chronic Condition, where Dr. Bjoraker talks about the emotional well-being from the patient's perspective. So thank you again for listening to this episode of Care Connections. Remember, whether your needs are large or small, your Care Connect PSS team is here to provide the support you need. To learn more about the range of support offerings and to contact your Care Connect PSS team, call 800-745-4447, option 3, or visit www.careconnectpss.com.